Chapter 1 Whispers from the Nile, an introduction to ancient Egyptian women. Hello there, friends, and welcome to another gentle journey into the depths of history. Whether it's the middle of the day or the quiet witching hour where you are, I invite you to settle in, get cozy, and let my voice carry you gently off to dreamland. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is in your corner of the globe. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. And if you enjoy drifting off to sleep to the hushed tones of history, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Now, let's set the scene, shall we? Picture this, the sun rising over the shimmering Nile, casting its golden glow across the desert sands. Farmers tend to lush fields along the river banks, while boats laden with goods drift lazily downstream. In the distance, the peaks of the Great Pyramids pierce the azure sky, standing eternal watch over the kingdom of the pharaohs. This is ancient Egypt, a civilization of wonder and might that endured for over 3,000 years. From the towering monuments of Giza to the glittering treasures of Tutankhamun's tomb, it's a world that has long captivated imaginations across the globe. But life in the land of the Nile was not all gold and glory. Beneath the veneer of power and prosperity lay a society with a stark divide between the haves and have-nots. And perhaps no group felt this inequality more keenly than women. To be sure, women in ancient Egypt enjoy some freedoms and legal rights that set them apart from their counterparts in other ancient societies. They could own property, conduct business transactions, and even initiate divorce proceedings. Some royal and upper-class women, like Nefertiti and Cleopatra, even wielded significant political influence. But make no mistake, this was still a deeply patriarchal world, one where women were considered inferior to men, both socially and legally. They were barred from holding positions of real power, shut out of the priesthood and the scribal class. They couldn't vote, couldn't serve on juries, couldn't independently make contracts. In short, they were second-class citizens from birth to death. An ancient Egyptian woman's life was largely defined by her relationship to the men around her. As a child, she was under the control of her father. As an adult, her husband, if widowed, her son. At every stage, she needed a male guardian to represent her interests and make decisions on her behalf. This lack of autonomy, combined with limited economic and educational opportunities, meant that most women, even among the upper classes, had very circumscribed lives. If they were lucky enough to be literate, it was usually just enough to keep household accounts. Their career options were mostly limited to domestic work within the household, and of course, their primary role was to bear children, many children, to replace the staggering number lost to disease and accidents. It's estimated that around 1 in 3 women in ancient Egypt died in childbirth. Without modern medicine, even a seemingly uncomplicated pregnancy or delivery could quickly turn deadly. Those who did survive might be fortunate to live into their 30s or 40s, old age by the standards of the time. But even a long life was no picnic. An elderly widow with no sons to support her might find herself cast out on the street, forced to beg for food and shelter. The lucky ones might be taken in by other family or welcomed into the temple as a servant. but many surely met lonely. Impoverished ends. Chapter 2. The Unseen Labors, Daily Toil and Domesticity. Let's delve deeper into the daily lives of these anonymous women, who formed the very backbone of ancient Egyptian civilization. They were the farmers, weavers, bakers, and brewers, and their daily lives were full of unrelenting labor. Due to a lack of educational opportunities, most worked in or near the home, grinding grain, baking bread, brewing beer, spinning linen, and tending to children and animals. It was hot, dirty, exhausting work, a relentless physical grind, with little rest or respite. Imagine for a moment the life of an ordinary Egyptian woman. Let's call her Nebet. She wakes before dawn to prepare breakfast for her husband and children. Soon, the house fills with the scent of baking bread. As she grinds the grain, kneads the dough, and stokes the fire, with the morning meal done, Nebet turns to her other chores. There's always mending to be done, patching torn clothing, repairing frayed baskets. She draws water from the well, her strong arms straining as she hoists the heavy jug onto her shoulder. In the corner, a baby fusses, and she pauses her work to offer a breast. As the day grows hotter, Nebet joins the other women of the village down by the river to do the washing. They slap wet clothes against the rocks, gossiping and laughing together as they work. For a moment, in the easy camaraderie of female company, Nebet almost forgets her troubles. But soon she must return to them. In the evening, footsore and weary, she prepares the evening meal. Her husband comes in from the fields, tired and hungry. Nebet serves him first the choicest morsels, as a good wife should. She eats what's left, usually with the children. Even after night falls, Nebet finds no rest. She is expected to be available to her husband, submitting to his desires regardless of her own wants or needs. Pregnancy is an ever-present possibility, and with it, the specter of death in childbed. This is the unending cycle of Nebet's life. From maiden to mother to crone, her body ages before its time, worn out by hardship and toil. If she's lucky, her children, particularly her sons, will care for her in her twilight years. Otherwise, she faces the prospect of destitution and abandonment. Nebet's story is the story of countless Egyptian women, their names and faces lost to history. They left no monuments, commanded no armies, wrote no great works of literature, but it was their unseen, unrecognized labor that sustained Egyptian civilization for millennia. In a society that deemed them lesser, they found ways to support each other, carving out small spaces for expression and agency in a world that granted them little. Personal hygiene was another challenge. In an age without indoor plumbing or sanitation, while the wealthy might enjoy limestone toilet seats and small bathing rooms, most Egyptians relieved themselves in chamber pots or directly in the river, an unsavory prospect, considering the Nile was also their primary source of drinking water. Diseases like typhoid, cholera, and dysentery were rampant. Surviving to adulthood was an accomplishment, as up to half of all children died before age 5. Those who reached maturity usually didn't savor it long. Archaeologists tell us the average life expectancy for an ancient Egyptian woman was about 30. Assuming she was fortunate enough to survive repeated pregnancies and childbirths. Chapter 3. The Cradle and the Grave. Motherhood and Mortality. Childbearing usually began early and ended late. It wasn't uncommon for girls to be married off as young as 12 or 13, usually to a much older man. These age gaps could be significant, 20, even 30 years, between husband and wife. A 14-year-old girl might find herself married to a man in his 40s, a disparity that only underscored the power imbalance between the sexes. Successive pregnancies would follow one after the other, in an attempt to produce as many healthy children as possible, especially sons, to carry on the family name and lineage. With little to no formal medical care, each pregnancy was a game of Russian roulette. Any number of complications, from preeclampsia to obstructed labor, could easily result in the death of mother, baby, or both. The ancient Egyptians did have some surprisingly advanced medical texts for the time, many of which have survived to the present day. The Aber's Papyrus, for example, is a 110-page scroll from around 1500 BC that covers a wide range of medical conditions and treatments, from heart disease to depression to birth control. But as advanced as some of this knowledge was, it was still primarily focused on the treatment of men. Women's health issues, from menstrual disorders to breast cancer, received comparatively little attention. And of course, without antibiotics, antiseptics, or any real understanding of germs and hygiene, even the most skilled physician could do little to stem the tide of infectious diseases that cut down so many young mothers in their prime. Against this grim backdrop, it's all the more remarkable when we encounter women in ancient Egypt who managed to rise above their prescribed roles and leave a mark on history. Women like Merit Petar, the first recorded female physician in the world. Merit Petar lived around 2700 BC. During the early period of the Old Kingdom, she bore the title chief physician and appears to have attended primarily to the needs of women at the royal court. While little is known about her life, her very existence testifies to the fact that at least some women in ancient Egypt were able to break through the gender barriers and achieve positions of skill and prestige. In a time when women's health was often neglected, Merit Petar made it her mission to care for her fellow women. She would have treated a wide range of ailments, from the everyday aches and pains to the life-threatening complications of childbirth. Her knowledge and skill must have been extraordinary, as she navigated the complex world of ancient Egyptian medicine with a focus on the unique needs of women. One can only imagine the relief and gratitude that her patients must have felt, knowing that there was someone who understood their struggles and was dedicated to their well-being. Merit Petar's legacy echoes down through the ages, a reminder that even in the most challenging of circumstances, there have always been those who fought for the health and dignity of women. Chapter 4. Gilded Cages, Royalty, Power, and the Precarious Crown. Ironically, though, even as real Egyptian women struggled for basic freedoms and dignity. Their idealized forms were being elevated to divine status in the official state religion. Goddesses like Isis, Hathor, Sekhmet, and Nut played vital roles in the Egyptian pantheon, reflecting different aspects of femininity, fertility and motherhood, love and beauty, wrath and warfare, creation and destruction. But here do we see the double standard at play. While goddesses were venerated and temples built in their honor, mortal women were still excluded from the higher ranks of the priesthood. The loftiest religious role most women could hope to attain was that of a chantress, a kind of singer or musician who participated in temple ceremonies, but they were strictly segregated from the inner sanctums and the holiest of rites, which remained the exclusive domain of male priests. One of the few exceptions to this rule was as chantress of Amun during the 23rd dynasty of the Third Intermediate Period, around 800 BCE. Isit bore the grandiloquent title Chief of the Harem of Amun, which, despite its lascivious connotations, actually referred to an order of priestesses dedicated to the god Amun. As one of Amun's chantresses, she would have sung and performed music during religious festivals and processions. She also would have had a role in managing the sizable estates and holdings belonging to Amun's cult. It was a rare position of some authority for a woman, but still ultimately subordinate to the male high priests. For royal and upper-class women, life may have been materially comfortable, but it was no less circumscribed by rigid gender expectations. Wives and mothers of the pharaoh might wield some degree of influence behind the scenes, but their power was always borrowed, never fully their own. Even mighty queens like Tai, Nefertiti, and Nefertari governed at the pleasure of their divine husbands, and could be summarily cast aside when they were no longer of use or interest. In 3,000 years of ancient Egyptian history, only a handful of women ever managed to rule as pharaohs in their own right, and even they did so only briefly and with varying degrees of success. The most famous of these is undoubtedly Hatshepsut, the fifth pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, who ruled for over 20 prosperous years in the 15th century BCE. The daughter of the great warrior Pharaoh Thutmose II, Hatshepsut was never supposed to inherit the throne in her own right, but when her husband and half-brother Thutmose died prematurely, leaving only an infant son to succeed him, Hatshepsut stepped into the breach, first as regent and then audaciously as pharaoh herself. To legitimize her reign, Hatshepsut set about systematically masculinizing her image. In statues and reliefs, she is depicted wearing the traditional pharaonic regalia, the crown, the false beard, even the shendi kilt. She referred to herself using male pronouns and titles. For all intents and purposes, she became a man in both form and function, and by all accounts, she ruled well and effectively, ushering in a period of peace and plenty for Egypt. She expanded trade networks, commissioned grand building projects, like her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, and even mounted a successful military campaign in Nubia. But for all her achievements, Hatshepsut's legacy was ultimately not secure. After her death, her names and images were systematically chiseled out of monuments, her statues smashed, her accomplishments attributed to the male pharaohs who came before and after. It was as if the powers that be were trying to erase the memory of a woman who dared to rule as a man. Such was the fate of even the most exceptional women in ancient Egypt. No matter how high they might rise or what they might achieve, their place in society was always precarious. Their hard-won gains easily eroded or erased entirely by the capricious currents of male-dominated power structures. As the sun sets over the Nile and the last embers of our story flicker and fade, it's hard not to feel a sense of melancholy for all the women of ancient Egypt, whose lives were so constrained, whose potential was so blunted by the rigid hierarchies of their time. For every Nefertiti or Hatshepsut who managed to break the mold, how many thousands of anonymous women lived and died in obscurity, their hopes and dreams buried with them in the sand. Chapter 5. Divine Reflections, Religion, Beauty, and the Double Standard. But perhaps there is a glimmer of hope to be found in their stories as well. A reminder that even in the most oppressive of circumstances, the human spirit still yearns to be free, to stretch beyond the confines of the roles and expectations placed upon it. That women, then as now, have always found ways to resist, to persevere, to leave their mark, however subtle or fleeting. So let us remember the women of ancient Egypt, both the great and the small. Let us honor their struggles and their triumphs, their joys and their sorrows, and let us continue to work towards a world where every woman, no matter her station or circumstance, has the freedom and the power to shape her own destiny. And with that, my friend, we come to the end of our journey for tonight. I hope you've enjoyed this bit of armchair Egyptology, and that you've managed to drift a bit closer to the land of Nod in the process. Until next time, I wish you the sweetest of dreams, filled perhaps with visions of golden barks and shining pyramids. Good night. Despite the challenges women faced, there were some extraordinary females who managed to make their mark on ancient Egyptian society against all odds. One such woman was Hatshepsut, the longest-reigning female pharaoh in Egyptian history. Born into the royal family, Hatshepsut was never intended to rule in her own right. But when her husband and half-brother Thutmose II died young, leaving only an infant son as heir, Hatshepsut stepped up to serve as regent, rather than fade into the background once her stepson came of age. Hatshepsut made a bold and unprecedented move. She declared herself pharaoh, taking on the full royal titular and regalia. Depictions show her wearing the traditional false beard and male clothing of a king. She even went so far as to declare herself the daughter of the chief deity Amun, asserting divine legitimacy to rule. For over 20 prosperous years, Hatshepsut governed Egypt as pharaoh, not merely queen. She oversaw ambitious building projects, including her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, with its elegant colonnades and towering cliffs. Expeditions to the fabled land of Punt brought back luxury goods and exotic wonders. Unlike many male rulers who focused on military campaigns, Hatshepsut's reign was characterized by peace, stability, and economic success. Despite her many accomplishments, Hatshepsut's legacy was nearly erased after her death. Her stepson and successor, Thutmose III, perhaps resenting her power, had her name and image chiseled off monuments. For centuries, she was forgotten, reduced to a mere footnote in the grand arc of Egyptian history. But modern Egyptologists pieced together her story from the scraps of history she left behind. It's a testament to Hatshepsut's tenacity and skill that she was able to rule successfully in a world where women were systematically denied political power. One can only imagine how many other women of ambition and intelligence were never given the chance to make their mark. Hatshepsut's tale is a reminder that even in the face of oppression, there will always be those who refuse to be constrained by the limitations placed upon them. Her reign was like a shimmering oasis in the desert, a brief respite from the unrelenting harshness of a world built for men. But for the vast majority of Egyptian women, life remained an endless cycle of domestic labor, childbearing, and subservience. From birth to death, they were at the mercy of the men in their lives. Fathers, husbands, brothers, sons. Their world was circumscribed by the walls of home and hut. Their horizons limited to the daily grind of cooking, cleaning, and caregiving. Chapter 6 echoes in the sand, personal stories and enduring spirits. The pressure to maintain a youthful appearance was particularly intense, as aging was seen as a sign of decline and decay. Women would go to great lengths to preserve their youth, using a variety of creams, oils, and other concoctions to stave off the effects of time. The idea that a woman's value was tied to her physical appearance was deeply ingrained in Egyptian society, and failing to meet these standards could lead to severe consequences. But perhaps no woman in ancient Egypt felt the weight of these expectations more keenly than Cleopatra VII, the last queen of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Born into a world of opulence and intrigue, Cleopatra was renowned for her beauty, wit, and intelligence. She used her physical charms as a tool of statecraft, famously seducing both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony to secure her position and protect her kingdom. But despite her power and influence, Cleopatra was still bound by the same beauty standards as her contemporaries. She was known for her elaborate wigs, heavily kohled eyes, and exquisite jewelry, all carefully crafted to create an image of allure and mystery. Her very name has become synonymous with a kind of timeless exotic beauty. Yet, in the end, even Cleopatra could not escape the realities of life as a woman in ancient Egypt. Despite her many accomplishments, she is often remembered more for her appearance and romantic entanglements than for her political acumen or leadership skills. Her story is a reminder of how women, even at the highest levels, were often reduced to their physical attributes and judged by their ability to conform to narrow beauty standards. As we drift deeper into the world of ancient Egyptian women, we find ourselves in the realm of religion and spirituality. Here, too, we see glimpses of female power and influence, but always within the confines of a patriarchal system. Women were not entirely excluded from religious life, but their roles were often limited and circumscribed. The ancient Egyptian pantheon was populated by a vast array of deities, some of whom were female. Goddesses like Isis, Hathor, and Sekhmet were revered for their strength, fertility, and protectiveness, and their cults attracted devotees from all walks of life. Women would often call upon these goddesses for aid and comfort, particularly in matters related to childbirth and motherhood. But while these female deities were powerful in their own right, they were often seen as subordinate to their male counterparts. The chief gods of the Egyptian pantheon, Ra, Osiris, and Horus, were all male, and their stories and mythologies tended to center around their exploits and achievements. Female deities, by contrast, were often relegated to supporting roles. Their power derived from their relationships to male gods. This gender imbalance was reflected in the priesthood as well. While women could serve as priestesses in certain temples, their roles were often limited to secondary positions like chantress or senger. These women would participate in rituals and ceremonies, but they were not permitted to perform the most important rites or to hold positions of real authority. However, there were some exceptions to this rule. One such example is the story of Isis, a chantress who served in the temple of Amun during the 20th dynasty. Isis was a woman of great talent and ambition, and she rose through the ranks of the temple hierarchy to become a divine adoratress, a position of significant influence and prestige. As a divine adoratress, Isis would have been responsible for performing important rituals and ceremonies in honor of the god Amun. She would have been a key figure in the religious life of the community, and her position would have afforded her a degree of wealth and status that was rare for women in ancient Egypt. But even as a divine adoratress, Isis was still subject to the limitations placed on women in Egyptian society. Her power was ultimately derived from her relationship to the god Amun, and her authority was always subject to the will of the male priests who outranked her. She may have been a trailblazer in her own right, but she was still operating within a system that placed women in a subordinate position. Chapter 7. A Timeless Legacy, Conclusion and Reflection. For most women in ancient Egypt, religious life was centered around the domestic sphere. They were expected to worship household deities related to fertility, childbirth, and family life. Their religious observances were often tied to their roles as wives and mothers. The idea of women as the keepers of domestic piety was deeply ingrained in Egyptian culture, reinforcing the notion that a woman's primary purpose was to bear and raise children. As we leave the world of religion and spirituality, we find ourselves in the glittering realm of royalty and the ruling class. Here, too, we see glimpses of female power and influence, but always within the confines of a patriarchal system. Women could, on rare occasions, ascend to the highest levels of power in ancient Egypt, but their authority was always contingent on their relationships to men. One of the most famous examples of a female ruler in ancient Egypt is Hatshepsut, who ruled as pharaoh during the 18th dynasty. Hatshepsut was a remarkable figure in many ways, a skilled politician, a shrewd diplomat, and a successful military leader. But what makes her story truly extraordinary is the fact that she was able to rule at all. Given the deeply entrenched gender norms of Egyptian society, Hatshepsut came to power as a regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III. After the death of her husband, Thutmose II, but rather than simply serving as a placeholder until Thutmose III came of age, Hatshepsut took on the full powers and trappings of kingship, even depicting herself in male clothing and with a false beard in official artwork. For more than 2 decades, Hatshepsut ruled Egypt as pharaoh, overseeing a period of great prosperity and artistic achievement. She commissioned grand building projects, expanded trade networks, and led successful military campaigns. By all accounts, she was a capable and effective leader, and her reign was marked by stability and growth. However, despite her many accomplishments, Hatshepsut's legacy was ultimately shaped by the fact that she was a woman in a man's world. After her death, her successor, Thutmose III, embarked on a campaign to erase her memory, defacing her monuments and removing her name from official records. While her reign was remarkable, it was also seen as an aberration, a temporary deviation from the natural order of things. Hatshepsut's story is a reminder of the ways in which women in ancient Egypt, even at the highest levels of society, were always subject to the whims and expectations of men. A woman might be able to rule as pharaoh, but her power was always contingent on the approval and acceptance of the men around her. And in the end, her legacy was often determined not by her own achievements, but by the way in which she was remembered or forgotten by the men who came after her. As we come to the end of our journey through the lives of women in ancient Egypt, we are left with a sense of both awe and sorrow. The women we have encountered, from the humble village dweller to the mighty queen, were remarkable in their resilience, their strength, and their ability to carve out a place for themselves in a world that was often hostile to their very existence. But for all their accomplishments, these women were still ultimately bound by the same oppressive gender roles and expectations that have plagued women throughout history. They may have had moments of power and influence, but these were always tempered by the reality of their subordinate status in society. In ancient Egypt, women were revered in myth and art as the embodiment of fertility, beauty, and motherhood. But in reality, they were second-class citizens, their worth determined by their ability to bear children and maintain domestic harmony. They were excluded from positions of real power and authority, and their voices were often silenced or ignored. And yet, despite all of this, women in ancient Egypt found ways to assert their agency and make their mark on the world. They were healers and priestesses, artisans and entrepreneurs, queens and pharaohs. They left behind a legacy of resilience and determination that continues to inspire and challenge us to this day. As we drift off to sleep, Let us hold these women in our hearts and minds. Let us remember their struggles and their triumphs, their joys and their sorrows. Let us honor their memory by continuing the fight for gender equality and justice in our own lives and in the world at large. And let us dream of a future in which all women, regardless of their circumstances, are able to live with dignity, autonomy, and respect. A future in which the contributions of women are valued and celebrated, not just in myth and legend, but in the everyday realities of life. For the women of ancient Egypt and for women throughout history, this dream has been a long time coming. But as we close our eyes and let the sands of time sweep over us, we can take comfort in the knowledge that change is possible, that progress is happening, and that a better world is within our reach. So let us rest now, and let us dream of that world, a world in which every woman is free to be herself, to pursue her passions and her goals, to love and be loved, to live and to thrive. A world in which the stories of women are not just footnotes in the annals of history, but the very fabric of our shared human experience. And let us awaken tomorrow with renewed purpose and determination, ready to do our part in creating that world. For the women of ancient Egypt and for women everywhere, the fight goes on. But together, we can make a difference. Together, we can build a future in which all women can live with the dignity and respect they deserve. Chapter 8. Resilience by the Nile, the struggle and survival of ordinary women. Royalty might value their counsel, and some, like Nefertiti, even held sway over matters of state alongside their husbands. But even an Egyptian queen walked a precarious path. Her influence relied on remaining in the fickle pharaoh's good graces. Should she fall out of favor or fail to produce an heir, she could be cast aside, her status and security vanishing like a mirage in the desert. The tale of Queen Tai illustrates the heights a royal woman could reach, but also the limits she faced. As the great royal wife of Amenhotep III, Tai was one of the most powerful women of her time. Her husband so adored her that he built her a lavish palace and erected monuments in her honor. Tai's name appeared alongside Amenhotep's in official decrees, and she corresponded with foreign rulers, a rare privilege for a queen. Yet, for all her influence, Tai was still beholden to her spouse. When Amenhotep III died after a 38-year reign, she found her sway much diminished. Her son, the eccentric Akhenaten, supplanted her and embarked on a religious revolution that upended centuries of tradition. He moved the capital to a remote desert site and devoted himself to the worship of Aten, the sun disk, spurning the old gods. His queen, Nefertiti, joined him in this grand experiment. Tai seemingly had little choice but to quietly endure these upheavals in her twilight years, because even a queen as formidable as she could not openly defy the new pharaoh. The patriarchal system constrained her agency. It's telling that Tai, this shrewd stateswoman who helped rule Egypt at its peak of power, is best remembered today simply as a king's wife and king's mother. Her own legacy is overshadowed by the men she supported. such was the plight of even the most elite women in ancient Egypt. A gilded cage is still a cage. Queens may have resided in palaces dripping with Nubian gold and dined on delicacies from across the empire. But they knew their status could be stripped at any time, based on the whims of men. They poured their energies into advancing the prospects of their sons, knowing their own security in old age depended on having a male heir reach the throne. Only a handful of women managed to rule Egypt in their own right as female kings. The most famous, Hatshepsut, seized power after the death of her husband, Thutmose II, in the 15th century BC. Although intended only as regent for her young stepson, Hatshepsut declared herself pharaoh and reigned for over 2 decades. During the prosperous 18th dynasty, as pharaoh, Hatshepsut adopted all the trappings of male kingship. She wore the crown and ceremonial beard and referred to herself with male pronouns. She launched ambitious building projects and lucrative trade expeditions. By all accounts, she ruled effectively, bringing wealth and stability to Egypt. Yet, her story also reveals the precariousness of female power. Late in Hatshepsut's reign, her stepson, Thutmose III, came of age and was named co-ruler. Evidence suggests a power struggle between them. After her death, Thutmose III systematically chiseled Hatshepsut's name off monuments and relegated her to obscurity, possibly to legitimize his own rule. While he grudgingly left her mortuary temple standing, he literally tried to erase her legacy as pharaoh. For nearly all of ancient Egyptian history, the throne passed from father to son. The kingship was a male role, its duties entwined with masculine attributes. Hatshepsut ruled successfully by styling herself in the image of a male king. She was the exception that proved the rule. Women were not considered fit to govern on their own. The warrior queens of ancient Egypt faced similar challenges. Ahotep, wife of the pharaoh Seqenenre, took decisive action to defend her country against the invading Hyksos in the 16th century BC. After her husband was slain in battle, Ahotep may have served as regent and rallied the nation at a time of crisis. She was honored with the title King's Mother for ensuring the kingship passed to her sons, and Stela praises Ahotep as one who cares for Egypt. She looked after her soldiers. She guarded her. She brought back her fugitives and collected together her deserters. She pacified Upper Egypt and expelled her rebels. This inscription suggests she even led armies into battle, a remarkable feat for a woman of her time. Yet Ahotep's heroic deeds were in service of putting her male offspring, Kamose and Namose, on the throne. She held power temporarily as an interim leader until proper male rule could be restored. The ultimate goal was to uphold the patrilineal succession, not establish female leadership in its own right. Even the female rulers most successful at harnessing power still had to navigate the confines of a male-dominated system. Nefertiti, the iconic queen who ruled alongside her husband, Akhenaten, in the mid-14th century BC, is celebrated for her beauty and influence. But her authority derived from her wifely status, not an independent queenship. As the principal wife of Akhenaten, Nefertiti played a prominent role in the Amarna period religious reforms that elevated the god Aten above all others. She was depicted worshipping alongside her husband in novel artwork that emphasized the royal couple as intercessors with the divine. Some images even show Nefertiti in the conventional poses of a male pharaoh, smiting enemies or making offerings to the gods. However, Nefertiti disappears from the historical record in the later years of Akhenaten's reign, possibly due to falling out of favor or dying prematurely. Her ultimate fate is unknown. Despite her high status, she relied on her husband's beneficence and may have been discarded when she was no longer useful to him. After Akhenaten's death, his son, Tutankhamun, born Tutankhaten, reversed the Amarna reforms and restored the traditional religious order. Under the guidance of influential advisors, he moved the capital back to Thebes and reinstated the powerful Amun priesthood his father had alienated. It's notable that Nefertiti did not rule as regent for her stepson, as other royal women had done. Her power was so intertwined with Akhenaten's that it could not survive him. The royal women who did wield direct power often had to grapple with the dangerous intrigues of court politics. Queen Twosret, the last ruler of the 19th dynasty, was a rare female who ruled independently as pharaoh. In the late 12th century BCE, she first served as regent for the child King Siptah, but took the throne in her own right after his early death. As a woman ruling alone, Twosret faced threats to her legitimacy from rival factions and would-be successors. She had to constantly shore up her authority and justify her rule. Significantly, Twosret adopted the full titulary of a male pharaoh and portrayed herself as a traditional king, fulfilling religious and military roles. Despite her efforts, Twosret's reign only lasted a few years before she was deposed by her male rival, Setnakht, founder of the 20th dynasty. Her monuments were usurped and her name largely erased from history. Another stark example of female power being deliberately obliterated by a male successor. These select stories of prominent royal women hint at the rigid gender hierarchy that permeated all levels of ancient Egyptian society. Women's identities were inextricably tied to their roles as mothers and wives, not merited by their own abilities or attributes. The few who managed to attain leadership had to adopt masculine roles and work within a system stacked against them. But what of the bulk of ordinary women who labored at much lower stations in life? The wives of farmers, tradesmen, and servants. The picture that emerges is in many ways bleaker, their lot characterized by poverty, drudgery, and all too often tragedy. Although the details of their daily lives have largely been lost to history, we can deduce much from ancient laws, medical texts, and archaeological finds. Take marriage, the social institution that defined most Egyptian women's lives. In a society without a robust social safety net, having a husband was essential for a woman's economic survival. For the father of the bride, arranging a match with a husband who could provide for his daughter was a foremost concern. The dowry given to the new couple also helped ensure the woman would be looked after. Ordinary women typically married around age 12 to 14, when they were viewed as ready for childbearing. Their husbands could be significantly older, already established in their work. Marriages were not so much romantic partnerships as practical arrangements. The husband was expected to support and protect his wife, while she was obligated to bear children and run the household. Since no organized religion held sway, and there was no official registry of marriages, matrimony was essentially a private contract between families. The terms could be negotiated to allow for divorce initiated by either party. But in practice, the system favored men who held more financial and social clout. If a marriage failed, the woman was usually the one to lose her home and purpose. For a woman to initiate divorce, she needed strong justifications, such as abuse, adultery, or lack of financial support, and the backing of male relatives who would take her in. A man could divorce his wife far more easily, sometimes on a mere whim. The most a woman could generally hope for was the return of her dowry, so she could remarry or live independently. This imbalance put immense pressure on women to be attractive, differential spouses who upheld domestic harmony at all costs. The stakes were high in a world where a failed marriage could consign a woman to destitution. Many must have endured unhappy unions simply to preserve their precarious position. Chapter 9. Resilient Spirits in the Desert, Personal Stories, and Enduring Hope. With marriage came the expectation of many pregnancies. To ensure the survival of at least some offspring into adulthood, childbirth was extremely perilous in an era before modern medicine. By some estimates, as many as 1 in 3 women ultimately died from complications related to pregnancy and delivery. The cemeteries of ancient Egypt hold the remains of countless young mothers. Surviving childbirth was no guarantee of longevity. The average life expectancy was around 35 years, though some particularly fortunate individuals lived into their 60s or 70s. Women who outlived their husbands had to hope their grown children, especially sons, would support them. The elderly childless risked being reduced to begging. Households were multi-generational, with grandparents, parents, and children residing together. Younger women did the bulk of strenuous housework, grinding grain, baking bread, brewing beer, spinning flax into linen, tending the hearth. Archaeologists have found skeletal evidence of the toll this repetitive labor took on their bodies. In poor homes, cramped living conditions, lack of sanitation, and contaminated food and water meant illness was rife. Parasitic diseases like schistosomiasis and malaria afflicted the populace, along with bacterial infections. Although Egyptian physicians developed some sophisticated medical techniques, their understanding was still limited, and many of their cures were ineffective. Women were all but barred from gaining an education or entering the elite professions of scribe, priest, or government official. When boys reached adolescence, they would go off to learn a trade, while girls stayed home to be molded into good wives under their mother's tutelage. The female realm was a small, circumscribed one, passed down through the generations. although some women worked outside the home in jobs like maidservant, nursemaid, dancer, or musician. They labored at the fringes of society. There is scant evidence of women working as the artisans and craftsmen who were the backbone of the Egyptian economy. The sculptors, carpenters, potters, metalsmiths, and jewelers producing the great civilization's material culture. One of the few ways for a woman to gain status was as a priestess, participating in the rituals of the temple cults. Yet this role, too, was subordinate to the male priests, who presided over the most sacred rites. The most prominent female religious title was God's wife of Amun, granted to select royal women who acted as ceremonial brides of the deity. Even in death, the gulf between the sexes remained stark. The mummification and burial practices had evolved to ensure a smooth passage to the afterlife, focused on the needs of men. The lavish provisions and spales inscribed on tomb walls emphasized the male occupant's identity and accomplishments. Wives were often depicted as passive companions. The great Egyptologist Zahi Hawass estimates that only roughly a third of the mummies discovered from ancient Egypt are female. It seems that even in the quest for eternal life, women were an afterthought. Those who were mummified were often interred in the tombs of their husbands, their own identities subsumed. From cradle to grave, ancient Egyptian women faced a harsh reality. Their lives were defined by their relationships to men, fathers, husbands, brothers, sons. They were prized as mothers and homemakers, but shut out from public life. The few who achieved power did so by emulating masculine roles that were otherwise off limits. Yet, it would be a disservice to define ancient Egyptian women solely by their oppression. Within the confines of their prescribed roles, many found ways to make their mark and carve meaning into difficult circumstances. They raised children, tended homes and businesses, served in temples, and upheld the social order. Some lived with grace, dignity, and even influence. Take the example of Hatshepsut, a woman who lived during the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom. Over 4,500 years ago, she bore the impressive title Overseer of Healers, indicating she was a physician in an era when medicine was a respected art. As the administrator of a medical school, she helped train other practitioners in the healing arts. Hatshepsut was also styled as a king's acquaintance, suggesting she was known to the ruler, perhaps even serving the royal household. For a woman to reach such a high station in a field like medicine was vanishingly rare. She must have been exceptionally capable to overcome the barriers to female education and professional advancement. Then there is Nanak, a female worker from the artisan village of Deir el-Medina, who lived during the 20th dynasty of the New Kingdom over 3,000 years ago. Her last will and testament has survived on papyrus, giving us a remarkable window into her life and personality. As a widow, Nanak took charge of distributing her own property. In her will, Nanak leaves the bulk of her estate to 3 of her 8 children, who supported her in old age, showing a practical streak. She also frees several of her servants, demonstrating a degree of wealth and authority. That a woman of relatively modest means could own property and have agency to bequeath it as she chose. Reveals women had some limited financial autonomy. The will hints at family drama, with non-act chiding some of her children, who have not paid attention to me during my lifetime. Far from a passive figure, she comes across as a formidable matriarch, well aware of her own mind and interests. One gets the sense non-act would not let herself be pushed around. These fleeting glimpses of individual women who asserted themselves within an oppressive system are a reminder not to view the women of ancient Egypt as a monolithic group. They had hopes and dreams, quirks and foibles. They loved their children fiercely and likely took pride in their accomplishments. However unsung, we can recognize the injustice of the world into which they were born, while still appreciating their humanity. Their lives were a mosaic of small triumphs and private tragedies, of difficult circumstances faced with fortitude. In their struggles, setbacks, and sacrifices, there is a poignant universality that echoes across the ages. Chapter 10. Threads of Time. The imprints of ancient Egyptian women's lives. So when we picture the woman in ancient Egypt, we should see her in her complexity, laboring in the fields, her skin bronzed by the sun, presenting offerings to household gods, her heart full of unspoken prayers, bartering in the market, keenly aware of her family's needs, holding her child close, knowing each day is precious, lifting her eyes to the distant horizon, wondering what lies beyond. Hers was a life constrained, but not without meaning, a life unrecorded in the grand monuments, but woven into the very fabric of her civilization, a life like countless others then and now, in which the personal and the political are inextricably intertwined. To trace the history of ancient Egyptian women is to map the contours of human resilience in the face of adversity. It is to be reminded that progress is not inevitable, but hard-won, that gender equality is not a modern invention, but an eternal aspiration, that women's voices, long silenced, have always yearned to be heard. In studying their lives, we honor their memory and bring their stories into the light. We acknowledge that women are not footnotes in history, but essential threads in the tapestry of our shared experience. For only by reckoning with the past in all its complexity can we hope to weave a more just and equitable future. The women of ancient Egypt call to us across the millennia, their whispers echoing through the halls of time. Let us listen to their tales of toil and triumph, of love and loss. Let us remember them not as passive victims, but as active agents navigating an imperfect world. Let us carry their legacy forward, so that no woman's story is ever lost to the shifting sands. In their honor, let us work towards a world where every woman can live with dignity, autonomy, and opportunity. A world where daughters are valued as much as sons, where wives are true partners rather than property. A world that would be unrecognizable to our ancient sisters, but one they surely dreamed of as they gazed. Let's journey back now to the banks of the Nile, where the cycles of flooding brought both abundance and destruction. Each year, the great river would swell and burst its banks, blanketing the surrounding fields in a thick layer of rich black silt. For a few precious months, the land would spring to life, lush greenery sprouting from the earth, heavy grains ripening under the scorching sun. The very heartbeat of Egypt depended on this delicate dance with the Nile, and no one understood that precarious balance better than the kingdom's farmers, many of whom were women. While it's true that agriculture was seen as men's work, the reality is that women toiled alongside their husbands, brothers, and sons in the fields. During planting and harvest seasons, especially, it was all hands on deck. Women sowed seeds, hauled water, threshed grain, and ground flour from dawn until dusk, their lean bodies glistening with sweat. With so many able-bodied men conscripted into the army or laboring on Pharaoh's monumental building projects, managing the crops increasingly fell to the women left behind. On larger estates, noble women might oversee the logistical symphony of planting schedules, irrigation efforts, and produce storage. But the back-breaking labor was always left to peasant women. A woman's value was measured in how many baskets she could fill, how many hours she could work under the unrelenting Egyptian sun. One of these women was Senetemet, a farmer's wife from the village of Deir el-Medina. Day after day, Senetemet would rise before the sun, wrapping her sleeping children in cool linen before venturing out into the fields. With a hoe balanced on her shoulder and a baby strapped to her back, she'd spend hours bent double, coaxing stubborn seedlings from the earth as the crops grew high around her and the harvest approached. Senetemet's anticipation mingled with dread. A good yield meant food on the table, goods to barter, and offerings to placate Renenutet, the cobra-headed goddess of the harvest. But bringing in the grain was a race against time, a Herculean task that consumed every moment from first light to last. Through it all, Senetemet found small joys where she could. In the scent of freshly turned earth, the satisfying ache of tired muscles at day's end, the giggles of her little ones chasing each other through the rows of wheat stalks. Tending the land was bone-wearing work, but it was also a reminder of her quiet strength, her endurance in the face of unimaginable adversity. For women like Senetemet, being a farmer was not a choice, but a necessity, a means of survival in a world where their worth was so often undervalued. They poured their blood, sweat, and tears into the unyielding Egyptian soul, knowing although that the fruits of their labors would likely be enjoyed by others. The pharaoh, the priests, the landowners, they were the ones who reaped the benefits of the women's ceaseless toil. And yet, season after season, harvest after harvest, the women persevered. They rose with the sun and worked until their hands were raw and their backs ached. They birthed babies in the fields and nursed them as they picked flax. They mourned the loss of daughters, married off too soon, and sons sent off to fight in distant lands. Through it all, they endured because they had to, because their families depended on them, because in a society that so often dismissed their contributions, tending the land was a way to carve out some small measure of autonomy, of purpose. So the next time you imagine the lush fields and bountiful harvest of ancient Egypt, spare a thought for the women like Senetemet who made it all possible, the ones who rose before dawn and worked until dusk, their babies bouncing on their backs and their hands rough with calluses, the ones whose stories have been largely lost to history, but whose legacy endures in the very soil of the Nile Delta. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to flicker in the darkening sky, Sennetemet would gather her little ones close and whisper stories of Osiris and Isis, of the eternal cycle of death and rebirth. She knew that her own life was just a small piece in a vast and noble tapestry, but she also knew that her hard work and sacrifices were weaving something beautiful, something enduring. In the face of unrelenting hardship, Sennetemet and countless women like her found ways to create meaning, to carve out spaces of joy and resilience. They may have been relegated to the margins of history, but their quiet strength and indomitable spirits echo through the ages. Chapter 11. The Indomitable Female Spirit, an ode to strength and hope. The story of ancient Egyptian women is one of struggle and subjugation, yes, but it is also one of profound courage, resilience, and grace under pressure. These women bore the weight of their society on their shoulders, and they did so with a fortitude that deserves our deepest respect and admiration. So, let us remember them, these unsung heroes of the Nile. Let us honor their sacrifices and celebrate their triumphs, however small. And let us strive to create a world where no woman must toil in obscurity, where every contribution is valued and every voice is heard. As we drift off to sleep tonight, let us dream of a different kind of Egypt, one where women like Sennetemet are not just the backbone of society, but its beating heart, one where they are free to pursue their own paths, to shape their own destinies, and one where their stories are not lost to the sands of time, but are woven into the very fabric of history, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit in the face of even the most daunting odds. The wigs favored by wealthy Egyptian women were hot and heavy, made from human hair woven together with plant fibers and wool. For the elite, these wigs were adorned with gold ornaments, jewel pins, and intricate braiding. While stunning to behold, they were cumbersome to wear, trapping heat against the scalp and straining the neck with their weight. Imagine the wife of a high-ranking scribe preparing for a banquet at the palace of the pharaoh. Her servants spent hours dressing her wig, weaving in strands of gold and fastening beads of lapis lazuli. The final creation towered above her head, a symbol of her status and beauty. But as the evening wore on, the heavy wig began to take its toll. Sweat beaded on her brow and trickled down her neck, dampening the fine linen of her gown. By the end of the night, her head throbbed and her neck ached from the burden of her own beauty. For royal women, the expectations were even higher. They were meant to embody the ideal of feminine perfection, their images carved into stone and painted on the walls of temples. Perhaps no queen played this role as skillfully as Cleopatra VII, the last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Born in 69 BCE, Cleopatra was not Egyptian by birth, but a descendant of the Greek Macedonian Ptolemaic line. She embraced Egyptian culture, learning the language and adopting the customs. But her true power lay in her mastery of self-presentation. Cleopatra crafted an image of herself as a living goddess, a sensual embodiment of Isis and Aphrodite. She adorned herself in golden robes and jewels, painting her face in the dramatic kohl and green malachite of the Egyptian style. When she first met Julius Caesar, Cleopatra was said to have been smuggled into his chambers. Rolled up in a carpet, she emerged like a gift from the gods, dazzling the Roman general with her beauty and wit. Cleopatra bore Caesar a son, Caesarion, solidifying her alliance with Rome. After Caesar's assassination, she charmed his successor, Mark Antony, hosting him for lavish banquets and decadent nights upon her perfumed barge. But beneath the intoxicating surface, Cleopatra's power was precarious. She ruled at the whims of fickle Roman politics, always one misstep away from ruin. In the end, as Octavian's forces closed in, she chose to take her own life, rather than be paraded through Rome as a captive. The asp, that potent Egyptian symbol, was said to have delivered her fatal bite. Cleopatra's story embodies the paradox of the Egyptian woman, at once powerful and powerless, deified and subjugated, for even a queen who seemed to have it all was, in the end, still a pawn in the games of men, while women like Cleopatra dazzled on the world stage. The spiritual lives of most Egyptian women were focused on the domestic sphere. The ancient Egyptians worshipped a vast pantheon of gods and goddesses, each with their own sphere of influence. For women, the most important deities were those associated with fertility, childbirth, and the home. Tauret, the hippo-headed goddess of childbirth, was invoked by women to protect them through the dangers of labor and delivery. Statuettes of Tauret were placed in homes. Her fearsome visage meant to scare away the demons that threatened mother and child. Bes, the dwarf god with the lion's mane, also guarded the household, his body humor and raucous dancing warding off evil spirits. Hathor, the cow-headed goddess of love, beauty, and motherhood, was among the most widely worshipped by Egyptian women. She was the patron of music, dance, and drunkenness. Her festivals were occasions for wild revelry. Women would shake sister rattles made of bronze and faience to summon Hathor's intoxicating spirit. In myth, Hathor was the consort of Horus, the divine son who avenged his father, Osiris. Together, they embodied the cycle of death and rebirth that was central to Egyptian spirituality. But while goddesses like Hathor and Isis loomed large in myth and temple, in the real world of ancient Egypt, women were largely excluded from positions of religious authority. The priesthood was overwhelmingly male, with women serving only in secondary roles, as musicians, dancers, and attendants. There were a few exceptions, such as the gods' wives of Amun, a lineage of royal women who held a semi-autonomous position at the Temple of Karnak. But for the most part, women's spiritual lives were confined to the household altars, where they prayed for fertility and protection. One woman who broke through these barriers was Isis, a chantress of the god Amun, who lived during the 20th dynasty around 1150 BCE. Isset's story is known to us through her elaborately decorated tomb in the Valley of the Kings, a rare honor for a woman of known royal birth. As a chantress, Isset would have sung and played music in the temples of Amun, participating in the daily rituals that sustained the god. Her tomb paintings depict her shaking a sistrum before offerings, her face alive with devotion. Isset's husband, Ramos, was a scribe in the temple, and together they seem to have formed a spiritually attuned partnership. But even for a woman of Isset's stature, true religious equality remained out of reach. Her role as chantress, while respected, was still seen as subordinate to the male priests, and her very presence in the Valley of the Kings, that most sacred of burial grounds, was an anomaly. For most women, the afterlife was a far more uncertain prospect. Their mummified remains interred in simple desert graves, as the sun set over the Nile, casting long shadows across the sand. The women of ancient Egypt returned to their homes, their duties for the day complete. They lit all lamps against the gathering dark, murmuring prayers to Tauret and Bes for protection through the night. In the flickering light, they might have reflected on the paradox of their lives, at once revered and restricted, celebrated and constrained. In the grand arc of history, the voices of these women are often lost, muffled beneath the bombast of kings and the clamor of war. But in the quiet moments, in the spaces between the lines of hieroglyphs, their stories can still be heard. They whisper of lives marked by hardship and resilience, of beauty and sorrow intertwined. For the women of ancient Egypt, life was a complex tapestry woven from the threads of duty, devotion, and desire. They navigated a world that both exalted and oppressed them, their power constrained by the very roles that defined them. As wives and mothers, they were celebrated, but as individuals, they were often overlooked. And yet, in the face of these challenges, Egyptian women found ways to assert their agency and leave their mark. They ruled as queens like Hatshepsut and Cleopatra, defying convention to claim power in their own right. They served as physicians like Merit Petar, tending to the bodies and souls of their fellow women. They channeled the divine in temples and homes, their voices rising in song to the goddesses who shaped their lives. In death, as in life, the women of Egypt sought to carve out their own destinies. They adorned their tombs with scenes of family and faith, ensuring that their stories would endure through the ages. And in doing so, they left us a legacy, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit has the power to endure and to inspire.